Dear guests, it's already 3 minutes past the time that we have planned to start this side event, and we thank you all for joining us today for this very important discussion. And thank you for the opportunity to speak on the challenges of democratic progress, problems in Central Asia. Today we have speakers that will discuss the issue of kleptocracies and corruption, how they impact democratic reform, human rights aspects in Central Asia. We have Marius Fossum from Norwegian Helsinki Committee and Tom Main from Freedom for Eurasia, that conducts anti-kleptocracy and corruption investigations, and online Amanda Strayer from Human Rights First will be joining us as well. So I will give the word to Tom to start with the explanation of what kleptocracy is and how it functions and its purpose and so on. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Leila. It's great to be presenting to you here today. Now, what does kleptocracy mean? Literally, it means rule of thieves. But I think it's a simplification to say that kleptocracy is based solely around theft. In essence, what kleptocracy is you take an asset or a company that either should be state-controlled or alternatively completely separate from the state, and instead you're making it a toxic mix of the two, where basically politicians and their family members and business associates are controlling the biggest private businesses in a particular country and profiting corruptly from them. We tend to think of kleptocracy as a characteristic of a government. However, in essence, it is rather a network of individuals, and a key component of this network is the fact that it is transnational. This transnational aspect is very important. Siphon money needs a destination. You need to take the money from a place where there isn't a rule of law, and it needs protection. You need to move it to a place where there is rule of law. So often, money stolen from particular kleptocracies end up in the UK, in Switzerland, in the EU. So I'm just going to take you through a few examples of kleptocratic proceeds of corruption via the various countries of Central Asia that were a part of the Soviet Union, all of which I think can be described to more or lesser extent as kleptocracies. In Uzbekistan, we have Gulnara Karimova, the daughter of the first president of Uzbekistan, who received 1 billion, I'll repeat that, 1 billion in bribes from a variety of telecoms companies. Freedom for Eurasia, we have a report entitled Who Enabled the Uzbek Princess? That shows how Karimova spent $240 million of these bribes on real estate in Switzerland, the UK, France, and other places. Let's go to Tajikistan. The country's main aluminium mining company is Talco, which is state-controlled. But the state company doesn't sell the aluminium. That is a private company registered in the British Virgin Islands, Talco Management, and it is that company that sells the aluminium abroad and accrues the profits. Who owns Talco Management? Well, much evidence suggests it's the president's family. In Turkmenistan, we have less information because the society is so closed, but we do know that the president personally controls the foreign currency reserves in Turkmenistan. In Kyrgyzstan, Maxim Bakiyev, the son of the president from 2005 to 2010, raided various businesses, everything from vodka factories to Megacom, a telecoms company. He was appointed by his father the head of a key business agency, which again demonstrates this toxic mix between private business and politicians' families. Kazakhstan, we have a new report as Freedom of Eurasia coming out later in this year, which will show that Karim Masimov was a beneficial owner of Kazakh Telecom, the main telecoms provider in Kazakhstan, while he was prime minister, so a clear conflict of interest. And it's outside of Central Asia, but I think Azerbaijan is worth a mention. The president's daughters possessed or have possessed various telecoms and mining assets. The President's family also owns £700 million worth of property in and around London. And I think all of us understand that 700 million has not been earned legitimately. This is the proceeds of corruption. So in those examples, I've touched on a few of the mechanisms that kleptocracies use. I've mentioned 3 or 4 times already telecoms. I think telecoms is a good example where you have a state aspect in the issuing of licenses and frequencies, but very easy to involve private actors, private companies who are actually accruing the profits. Middlemen companies are very popular in kleptocracies. This is where you have a company that basically doesn't really need to exist. It's selling the asset, the mineral or whatever it is, at a markup. Mentioned Talco from Tajikistan before. Another example, Rosukrenergo, the famous middleman company which was selling gas from Russia to Ukraine 10, 15 years ago. Another mechanism, you have state companies that are being sold off very, very cheaply. Once they're sold off, they of course become multi-billion-dollar companies. A good example of this would be in Kazakhstan with Timur Kulubayev, the son-in-law of the former president, who controlled privately various oil and gas assets in Kazakhstan, while at the same time being a state official in charge of the oil and gas industry. And of course, you just have out-and-out bribery. Karimova was bribed by the Swedish firm TeliaSonera. Also, Masimov was in Kazakhstan, receiving his bribes through his proxy, Aygul Nuriyeva. Yet that case hasn't, I think, featured that much in international press. There's not really been any mention of it, and we'll go into why a little bit later on. And again, want to stress again this transnational aspect. It is us in the West who are enabling this corruption to happen. It's our professional enablers, our real estate agents, our lawyers, our bank managers that are allowing this to happen. The money is coming to our banks through our companies and into our real estate markets. So what can we do to counteract kleptocracy? Well, of course, we should be using sanctions, and I think Amanda is going to talk about that a little bit later on. And so far, we just have not seen that in regards to Central Asia. The United States has only sanctioned 2 individuals as part of the Global Magnitsky Act from Central Asia, that being Gulnara Karimova and Raimbek Matraimov, a former customs official from Kyrgyzstan. And the UK has sanctioned 0 people from Central Asia, despite much evidence that the kleptocratic proceeds have been transferred to the United Kingdom. But I think sanctions are only a temporary solution, and they only, very importantly, they only freeze an asset. They don't seize the asset. You can't take that asset back through sanctions. For that, you have to show, at the moment, and at least a link to criminal activity. A lot of people say, well, all we need to do is spend some more money on law enforcement, get them to be a bit more capable, and then we can start cracking down on what's termed illicit finance. But we have 2 problems here. The first is that in kleptocracies, illegal acts are often ignored or even ruled legal. And secondly, corrupted funds may be completely legal. I'll repeat that. Corrupted funds may be completely legal. A good example of this would be Yevgeny Prigozhin from Russia. Everyone knows who he is. How did he make his money? Well, he was contracted to supply food to the Russian military and to Russian schools, completely legal. Of course, we know that contract came with various conditions. At the time, he was obviously very close with Putin, and he was running the troll farms and running the militias in various countries. But in terms of his the money he was using to do that, it was, in quotes, legally obtained through these state contracts. So it is very difficult to launch criminal proceedings or asset recoveries against somebody who is still in power, because you won't get the legal assistance, you won't get the documentation, and you will get the prosecutor's office of that particular country saying that this is completely legally earned capital. The Department of Justice in the United States was successful indicting Gulnara Karimova because a large multinational company was involved. The bribery was very obvious. And I think perhaps most importantly, Karimova had by that point lost power. Masimov, on the other hand, in Kazakhstan at that point was still prime minister, so any investigation into any potential bribes that he had received from Telya wasn't going to go anywhere. And this is researchers, this I think finding is borne out by research that myself and some of my colleagues have worked on in the last few years. We've examined property in the UK owned by what we class as politically exposed people, those people who hold political office. We found 72 incumbents, 72 properties, people still in office, and none of those were seized or subject to any kind of freezing order, whereas there are 13 cases of properties. All but one property was owned by an exile, somebody who had fallen out of favor, someone who had fallen out of the political class of that particular country. So unwittingly, perhaps, our anti-corruption efforts may be actually strengthening kleptocracy, because if the only people who are losing power, assets, money are political opponents, then that by its very nature means that those kleptocracies are strengthened. So finally, we need to think up some new ways of tackling this. One way perhaps would be to, in the UK, amend the Proceeds of Crime Act. Perhaps we need to take something that we do in regard to terrorist property. If something is terrorist property, we don't need to show the link to criminality. We're not interested in how the property was obtained. The fact that it's being used to further terrorism means it can be frozen. Now, obviously, kleptocracy is very different from terrorism, but can we use the same principle that if somebody is part of a kleptocratic network, can we freeze that property or asset because it is basically going to be classed as kleptocratic property? That's far in the future. Obviously, going to be a lot of legal pushback, on that. There have been other attempts, such as in the UK, the unexplained wealth order, where if somebody has got lots of wealth which is unexplained, you perhaps can freeze the asset, although that hasn't proven to be very successful so far. But make no mistake about it, there is a war between dirty and clean money, and the dirty money can infect democracies. Azerbaijan, if you remember, bribed politicians from the Council of Europe to vote against a report that highlighted human rights concerns. So it has very real-world consequences, not only for the countries in question that are losing all this money, but also for us in democracies. So I think I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. So I will now take turn to speak about the challenges of democratic progress in the Central Asian region. And as we reflect on the political landscape of this strategically important part of the world, it is essential to understand that the complex web of governance structures and the persistent obstacles to democratic reform. At the heart of this web lies kleptocracy, a system where those in power use their position for personal enrichment, often to detriment of the democratic development. Kleptocratic regimes have become a key impediment to democratic progress in Central Asia. In these systems, power is concentrated in the hands of the elites who amass wealth through corruption, patronage, and control of state resources. This kleptocracy is deeply intertwined with governance structures that are authoritarian in nature, characterized by a weak rule of law, limited or completely absent political pluralism, and an absence of checks and balances. These governance frameworks provide a fertile ground for the entrenchment of kleptocratic rule, where those in power prioritize self-interest over the needs of the people. One of the most concerning developments we've seen in the recent years is the deliberate adoption of anti-democratic measures by these regimes in Central Asia, particularly targeting civil society activism, free media, and opposition voices. For example, many Central Asian countries have introduced or are in the process of introducing anti-NGO laws that severely restrict the activities of non-governmental organizations, especially those working on issues of human rights, democracy promotion, and anti-corruption efforts. These laws often impose burdensome registration requirements, restrict access to foreign funding, and subject organizations to intense scrutiny and harassment. The situation for activists and journalists is equally dire. Laws and fabricated charges targeting free media and activism have proliferated, with government tightening controls over independent reporting and civic engagement. We see frequent attacks on free speech, the jailing of dissenting voices, and the demonization of activists as foreign agents or threats to national security. These regimes understand that controlling the narrative and suppressing alternative voices is critical to maintaining their grip on power. Perhaps one of the most alarming indicators of the region's drift away from democratic principles is the rising number of political prisoners. In many countries, individuals who dare to challenge the government, whether through peaceful protest, social media post, or political organization, are being imprisoned on trumped-up charges. These prisoners serve as a stark reminder of authoritarianism that underpins governance in many parts of Central Asia. They are held in deplorable conditions, often without due process, as a warning to others who might consider dissent. To give a specific example, we can look at the case of Kyrgyzstan, known for its vibrant civil society and free media, where a raft of anti-NGO and anti-activism laws have been passed in recent years. Activists, journalists, and opposition politicians are arrested under vague charges of extremism or terrorism, and a number of political prisoners are in the hundreds now and continues to climb. At the same time, the government has increased its grip on media, blocking independent outlets and intimidating journalists. The result is a shrinking space for democratic debate and civic engagement. Kazakhstan's oligarchs of the Nazarbayev era have been engaged in slap suits and harassment of Western civil society, whistleblowers, journalists, and even the law enforcement agencies in the West. Uzbekistan's first princess, Gulnara Karimova, that was mentioned by Tom, is managing to sell her assets in the West with considerable profit while sitting in an Uzbek prison with the help of her Western enablers. Independent media continues to report about corrupt practices of the relatives of the current Uzbekistan's President Mirziyoyev. Kyrgyzstan's ousted president Bakiyev's clan continues to conduct shady business using Lukashenko's protection and endless supply of fake Belarusian passports. Tajikistan's Rahmon regime has created an environment in which free assembly, free speech, and emergence of civil society actors is impossible. At the same time, the Rahmon regime continues to hold thousands of political and religious prisoners, activists, journalists, lawyers in life-threatening conditions of Tajikistan's prisons. Many are held incommunicado for years, unable to see their relatives or lawyers. Turkmenistan's Berdimuhamedov clan is enjoying mind-blowing luxury and total impunity while the population is struggling to put food on the table. All this is happening for the sole purpose of kleptocrats to continue enjoying their wealth and a possibility to store and spend it in the West with impunity. It's important to understand that these actions are not random, but a part of a calculated strategy by kleptocratic regimes to maintain control. By stifling dissent, silencing free media, and jailing opposition, they prevent any meaningful challenge to their authority. They know that a strong civil society and an informed, engaged public are essential ingredients for democratic reform. And so they seek to destroy these pillars before they can take root. The path to democracy in Central Asia is fraught with obstacles, but it is not impossible. For reform to take place, there must be sustained pressure from both internal and external actors. Civil society must continue to resist, which they do like heroes. And the international community must hold these regimes accountable for their human rights abusers and anti-democratic actions. While the road ahead may be long, the aspirations of the people of Central Asia for a more just, transparent, and democratic future should not be ignored or forgotten. Thank you so much. And now I give the floor to Marius Fossum from Norwegian Helsinki Committee to talk about the impact of kleptocracy and corruption on human rights.
Thank you, Leila. Good afternoon, everyone. When we in the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, and I guess other organizations like ourselves, monitor the human rights situation in Central Asia, we observe a pattern in which authorities routinely violate human rights in efforts to conceal human rights violations, nepotism, election fraud, and of course corruption, and a plethora of other crimes. In other words, authorities seek to suppress such information. Authorities seek to suppress any information that contradicts a state-cultivated, idealized image of the regime, the president, the state policies, and so on. This usually takes the form of persecution and imprisonment of whistleblowers, activists, bloggers, human rights defenders, and of course journalists, along with a rapidly shrinking space for freedom of expression and media freedom. For example, in just the last 3 years, Tajikistan have handed very long prison sentences to at least 9 journalists that we know of. One of them, Ulfat Khonim Mamadjoyeva, was given more than 20 years in prison. While in Uzbekistan, despite very loudly announced reforms by the administration, at least 30 journalists have been imprisoned in the country since Shavkat Mirziyoyev came to power in 2016. In Kyrgyzstan, last winter, the independent newsroom Temirov Live published a series of investigative reports on high-level corruption. Their reports implicated the Minister of Internal Affairs in Kyrgyzstan, Mr. Ulan Niyazbekov. I recommend everyone here to look up the YouTube channel Temirov Live and have a look at their investigations yourself. Anyway, authorities soon retaliated and arrested 11 of the journalists affiliated with Temirov Live. When I say journalists, I also mean they arrested one person who had been an intern with Temirov Live for just 2 months, and one cameraman who was no longer working for Temirov Live. That just shows you the ferocity with which authorities repress critical reporting in Kyrgyzstan. Last month we learned that the prosecutor had asked for 6 years imprisonment for all of the Temirov Live and affiliated journalists. And a verdict is expected on this Thursday. I call on every representatives here of diplomatic missions to raise their cases with the Kyrgyz government in any way appropriate. We will publish a press release about the upcoming verdict tomorrow that you can also look up. Anyway, Kyrgyz authorities, of course, have already closed down other newsrooms, and other Kyrgyz journalists are already in prison. The reason I'm mentioning it is that the case in Kyrgyzstan exemplifies a typical vicious cycle in which corrupt officials, just like Tom described, first exploit their positions to enrich themselves, and then crack down on media and civil society in order to suppress information about their crimes and to avoid accountability. And in this way, we see that corruption and the efforts to conceal corruption becomes a driving force in the ongoing erosion of human rights in Central Asia and elsewhere. What more is, when the police and courts protect perpetrators, as is the case in Kyrgyzstan, and authorities eradicate independent media, so there is no one left to hold officials accountable, then corrupt officials enjoy near full impunity for crimes of corruption and human rights violations. Targeted sanctions against individual officials for significant corruption and gross human rights violations could bring at least some form of accountability and could contribute to end this vicious cycle of impunity, corruption, and human rights abuses. But as Tom said, only 2 individuals from Central Asia have been sanctioned through the Global Magnitsky Act, and we're dismayed to see this decline of use of the existing sanctions mechanism. The Norwegian Helsinki Committee calls on the United States and the European Union to make greater and active use of their existing sanctions mechanisms, and we call for a greater responsiveness to civil society recommendations in this regard. Local civil society and groups like Freedom for Eurasia and the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, and local groups on the ground and the persecuted media actors in, for example, Kyrgyzstan, possess very valuable information in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marius. I would like to give the floor now to Amanda Strayer via Zoom, and she is the Senior Counsel for Accountability at Human Rights First, where she coordinates the Targeted Human Rights and Anti-Corruption Sanctions Coalition, a group of more than 330 NGOs using global Magnitsky sanctions and other legal authorities to hold human rights abusers and corrupt actors accountable. In this role, she serves as the primary liaison with the U.S. government personnel and assists NGOs working to produce recommendations for sanctions in the Near East, Europe, and Eurasia, and South and Central Asia. Amanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Leila. I hope you all can hear me okay. I wish I could be there with you all in person today, but I'm glad I can join in this capacity. As Leila mentioned, for the past 4 years, I've helped coordinate a global civil society coalition through my work at Human Rights First, and the coalition that helps advocate for the use of targeted sanctions in response to human rights abuses and corruption, or what we call Magnitsky-style sanctions. I work directly with NGO partners who are developing sanctions recommendations to submit to the U.S. government, and also coordinate with counterparts at organizations in the UK, EU, Canada, and Australia to help NGOs engage in similar advocacy in those jurisdictions. And in addition to this work, we also track trends in how the U.S. government and these other jurisdictions have been using their Magnitsky-style sanctions programs and the impact that these sanctions have had. So I'll be talking a lot about sanctions today, but in the U.S., there are many different legal authorities that the government uses to impose targeted sanctions, or those aimed directly at specific individuals and entities rather than sanctions that are impacting broader sectors of an economy or country-based sanctions. The consequences of targeted sanctions, as others have noted, include asset freezes, visa bans, and transaction blocking. So any of the individuals who are sanctioned are unable to engage in financial transactions with any U.S. person, business, or bank or other entity. Most of my work focuses on the U.S. Global Magnitsky Sanctions Program, which is the only sanctions program the U.S. government has that allows it to impose targeted sanctions on human rights abusers and corrupt actors anywhere in the world. The program's been around for about 7 years now, with more than 550 people and entities sanctioned under it to date across more than 50 countries. They've been sanctioned for things like arbitrary detention of opposition leaders, killings of journalists, repression of protests, state capture schemes, and a range of significant corruption, including bribery, embezzlement, money laundering, and more. However, as Tom and others have noted, the program's very rarely been used to address these kinds of abuses in Central Asia. The region, South Central Asia region, is one of the least targeted by this program to date. And we've only seen a handful of cases in the region, as has been noted, of Golnara Karimova and Rambak Matrimov. Since the Matrimov case nearly 4 years ago, there have also been no sanctions, either under the Global Magnitsky Program or any other U.S. sanctions program, on the basis of human rights abuses or corruption targeting anyone in Central Asia. So we've really seen over the last 4 years the U.S. not using not only the Global Magnitsky Sanctions Program, but really any of its sanctions tools to target this kind of kleptocracy or human rights abuses in the Central Asia region. And similarly, the U.S. government has other visa restriction tools that are similar but slightly different than its sanctions tools. But even there, again, very, very low levels that we're seeing of even using these perhaps less impactful tools to address the issues of corruption and human rights abuses in Central Asia. And these gaps are a real missed opportunity for the U.S. and for its allies to have an impact in this area, to bring accountability for these trends of kleptocracy and human rights abuses. Last year, Human Rights First, along with our partners at Redress, Open Society Foundations, Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, put out a joint report that looked at how we can assess the impact of Magnitsky-style sanctions. And when we talk about impact, people often think about the impact sanctions have on the particular set of abuses. Did the abuses or corruption stop? Did it change? What was the impact on the person's behavior? But what we've seen over the years is that impact is much more than just did the abuses stop? Did the corruption change? Or was money returned, et cetera? And I think a lot of these other forms of impact are particularly valuable and noteworthy when it comes to thinking about how we can use these tools to address kleptocracy, to address human rights abuses in this region, and are part of the reason why civil society groups so actively push for these types of measures. One of the things that I think sanctions are particularly great at is serving as to advance public accountability for these types of abuses, particularly in situations or countries where you have really closed media ecosystems, or where there's a real restriction on the ability of civil society to advocate and to draw attention to and raise awareness for these abuses. Sanctions can really help drive and bring attention and pressure to a situation and help align and signal support for civil society's efforts to push for reform, to push for accountability for those types of abuses. Sanctions obviously have a material impact on the perpetrators of these abuses. As we've noted, assets can be seized or, frozen. But in a few cases, we've also seen governments take additional measures to seize assets that were frozen through these sanctions. Sanctions can otherwise help serve as a deterrent for private sector that may be engaging either with that individual or entity that is sanctioned, or working in that sector to realign their activities away from those that might be considered putting them at risk of future sanctions enforcement actions. And I think more broadly, there's also what we consider a geopolitical impact of the sanctions in terms of how it helps strengthen and align a U.S. government action, for example, or coordinated action with its allies in response to these types of abuses. And sanctions themselves can also be used as a jumping off point for further advocacy by civil society at the UN or other international or regional mechanisms. So sanctions are just one tool in the toolbox, obviously. It's not always the right tool to address any particular given situation, but we've seen that these impacts tend to be heightened when sanctions are used in tandem with a range of foreign policy tools and responses for these types of abuses. And I'll just, on one final note before I pass it back to Layla, over the past few years, I think we've noticed a concerning trend of a steady decline in the use of global Magnitsky sanctions by the U.S. government. We saw kind of a high water mark around 2020, 2021. But since then, we've seen year-over-year drops in the number of individuals and entities that have been the focus of these sanctions programs. Last month, we helped organize a civil society letter signed by nearly 100 organizations to the U.S. government, highlighting this trend and calling attention to it. Just to give you kind of a sense of the scope of what we're talking about, in the last fiscal year, so the 2023 fiscal year, we saw a 56% drop in annual designations, primary designations, compared to the 2020 fiscal year. And the fiscal year that just concluded last month, the 2024 fiscal year, saw similarly low levels of sanctions under the Global Magnitsky program. And this is especially concerning, as we noted, that civil society recommendations were also among those that had been declining. So a lot of what we do, again, at Human Rights First has helped civil society organizations that have done documentation and have recommendations for the U.S. government as to how best to deploy these sanctions programs. We help connect those groups and the information that they've gathered and documented with the U.S. government so that it can potentially serve as the basis for future sanctions. And to date, the program has enjoyed about 1/3 of all of the global Magnitsky sanctions coming from the U.S. have had a basis in these civil society recommendations. But since January 2023, only about 10% of global Magnitsky sanctions cases have had a basis in civil society recommendations that we're able to track. So we really wanted to highlight both of those declining trends, that the overall numbers are down, and in response, we're also seeing a drop in civil society actions that appear to be based in civil society recommendations. I'm happy to say that within a month of sending the letter, the U.S. government's issued 3 new rounds of global Magnitsky sanctions in Georgia, Cambodia, and Haiti, making it the busiest September for the program to date. So perhaps things may be turning a corner, but we really think that this downturn overall in the numbers and responsiveness to civil society matter, because these sanctions have quite literally saved lives in some situations. They make a difference. Sanction actors fight hard to get removed from these sanctions lists because they don't like the constraints and they don't like the stigma. And civil society fights hard to get the sanctions in place in the first instance because they know that in a world where justice and accountability is rare for too many people, that these sanctions are a critically important way to call out and condemn bad actors and to build and strengthen support to push for reform and change and accountability. So I'll go ahead and end there and pass it back to Layla.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for this wonderful description and explanation of importance of the sanctions. I would like to open the floor to questions. You can raise your hand if you'd like to comment or ask a question. Thank you. Please, Sophia.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sophia Budai from the U.S. mission to the OSCE in Vienna. And basically, I wanted to thank all of the panelists for being here and for repeating these important messages. I don't really have a question, but I wanted to assure you that we understand the importance of sanctions, especially global Magnitsky sanctions, and the wheels of bureaucracy do turn slowly. So the message about how the amount of people's sanctions seem to have dropped, that's important, but I assure you there is work being done behind the scenes. But to all of our NGO partners, please continue giving us the information. It's a very high threshold to meet for some of these sanctions. So the more information we have on certain individuals, the better. Please continue feeding that to us, to your contacts in Washington, or to me, or to others. But these are important messages we need to hear. We understand that the frustrations about some of not just the slowness, but the inability to target some people or deal with specific issues. So we certainly understand the feedback, and we appreciate the feedback that you give. So that sounded very defensive, but I do want to say that we value the relationships we have and the information you give, and the more we know, the better, and we'll try to find the appropriate ways of certainly addressing these issues, including in public fora like here, where we can raise through our statements the short versions delivered orally, the longer versions online. We can call attention to some of these issues. So we always appreciate that feedback. And with that, I'll stop there, but wanted to mention all of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia, for this very important comment. Is there any questions or any thoughts, anybody? Yes, please, Amin.
Thank you for organizing a very important event on issues with exposing corruption. But my question is related with lack of attention of like-minded states for such kind of problem, because all our countries, like Central Asian countries and also countries like Azerbaijan, which is completely dependent from oil and gas export and other resources. Our like-minded partners don't invest enough for programs on implementations of the good governance program, integrity programs, and only few NGOs and few donors provide the interests. And I would like to say thanks for raising awareness on these topics, because most of the people, even like-minded, say they are talking about the human rights violations, lack of democracy, but they are not speaking about main sources of all of these threats, because this main sources is like a kleptocracy. We are speaking in this house by years and years, and remember last 20 years we're speaking personally myself, and nothing changed. But I believe if attention for exposing grand corruption in OSCE member states and institutional and capacity building support provided by like-minded state delivered properly to the civil society of these vulnerable countries and exile-based specialist communities, I definitely believe we're able to change situation and punish these kleptocrats. What do you think? Why during the 20 years we didn't see any clear political will from the Western communities on fight against corruption and kleptocracy? Sometimes they are staying shoulder to shoulder with us, but on the same time they are hosted like a Central Asian dictators, or like recently Olaf Scholz visited to Central Asia, meet with the rulers. Thank you again for all your events.
I can take it first. In relation to the UK, I mean, the UK relies a lot on its financial services, professional services, and I think what has been interesting, speaking personally, is when you meet diplomats from countries where there perhaps aren't as many UK interests, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, the British diplomats working there are more interested in these topics and also in human rights. And if you look at the all-party parliamentary groups in the UK Parliament, they will sometimes host meetings about human rights in Tajikistan, for example. When it comes to Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, it's a different matter because of our interests there. There, it's all about, pro-business. It's all about strengthening those ties. Generally speaking, perhaps over the last few years, the tide has started to turn maybe a little bit. Some of the things that we turned a blind eye to 20 years ago, perhaps we wouldn't anymore. Just one stat here, the UK's Tier 1 visa scheme, you could basically pay £1 million and get a visa to live in the UK. The UK gave 734 Russians a visa between 2008 and 2014. And during this period, there were absolutely no checks by the state on the source of the money. This seems to us now completely crazy after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and rapidly the UK was trying to scramble backwards by issuing sanctions, which basically puts a freeze on those people from entering the UK. And we have seen, the Tier 1 investment scheme closed now in the UK, and a lot of other countries are closing their golden passport schemes. Has that changed the UK's feeling towards Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan? I'm not so sure. And, we still see the same players, cashing in or cashing out their assets in the UK with not much done about it. Perhaps with the new government of the UK, there is a little bit more awareness of this, and certainly I've been hearing positive sounds from those quarters about needing to tackle this dark money. But I think in relation to those countries where we have big business deals, it remains to be seen.
Thank you so much, Tom. Is there any other interventions anybody would like to contribute to our discussion, please? Yes.
Да, спасибо, Лейла. Я бы хотел упомянуть несколько компаний, которые работают в Таджикистане и очень сильно занимаются коррупцией. Одну из этих компаний наш коллега назвал, это компания «Талко». Я не знаю, наш коллега знает или нет. Компания «Талко International», которая продает алюминий за рубежом, это она продает как раз английские компании, то есть продает Англии. Это раз. И другая компания, которая тоже занимается большой коррупцией в Таджикистане, это компания по продаже электроэнергии. Она называется Барк-Тоджик. То есть у нас есть... Таджикистан вообще уникальная страна. Она вот эти названия компании импортирует. Допустим, есть компания Talco, которая производит алюминий, а есть компания Talco International, которая продает. То есть все знают, что компания Talco это государственный, а никто не знает, чей компания Talco International. То есть в Таджикистане все знают это чей, но в мировом сообществе это неизвестно. Также и компания Барк-Тоджик. Есть компания Барк-Тоджик, которая производит электроэнергию, которая постоянно задалживается налога, и постоянно каждые 2-3 года парламент ратифицирует и президент подписывает, чтобы упростили долг компании. Но есть компания, которая продает, то есть она называется Фруши Барк-Тоджик, то есть компания Барк-Тоджик, которая продает Барк-Тоджик. Это уникальное свойство. И она, кстати, продает Афганистану основную свою электроэнергию, государство, которое не признано никем в мире, но при этом имеет компанию Брешно, которая занимается покупкой из Таджикистана для Афганистана электроэнергию. Эта коррупционная схема очень выгодна семье Рахмона. Она не связана ни с кем, она напрямую связана с семьей Рахмона. Если любой человек, который занимается хоть правозащитной деятельностью или журналистикой в Таджикистане, об этих компаниях знают. Есть также и компании, которые занимаются... То есть эти компании, которые связаны за рубежом. То есть они что-то производят в Таджикистане, а продают его за рубежом. Но есть еще и внутренние компании, которые только зарабатывают внутри Таджикистана. Допустим, компания ИРС. По некоторым из наших данных, это компания американская, то есть она зарегистрирована в Америке каким-то образом, и у них обычно и директоры, и гендиректоры американцы, то есть граждане Америки. Но она занимается только внутри Таджикистана, это платная дорога, которую собирает, и народ Таджикистана имеет единственную дорогу, она соединяет север Таджикистана и юг. И эта дорога платная, у таджикских граждан другого альтернатива нету. Но при этом эта компания зарабатывает больше 100 миллионов долларов в год, и она каким-то образом выводит свои активы за рубеж. То есть у нас в Таджикистане есть компании, которые занимаются продажей за границей. Понятно, да, это легче скрыть свои доходы уже в офшорах, а есть, которые из Таджикистана выводят. Я бы хотел попросить коллег, если кто-то бы смог бы нам разъяснить, каким образом можно... Я сейчас не буду говорить о компаниях китайцев, потому что их слишком много, и это уже нужно больше времени, чтобы этим заниматься. Но хотя бы вот в примере этих 3 компаний, как активы из Таджикистана выводятся. Спасибо.
Well, I think you've answered your own question. It's quite easy when you don't have beneficial ownership information, the information about who truly is owning these companies. And, I mentioned the British Virgin Islands, the UK, the mainland UK now has a beneficial ownership register, which is public. So anyone, in theory at least, can see who owns a particular company. British Virgin Islands has started collecting that information, but they're not making it public still. It's only available to the authorities. Now, the UK has, given a certain amount of independence to our overseas territories and crown dependencies, but we also have, full, jurisdiction over them. And I think there are some cases where we should actually be saying, well, if you want to, you should follow UK standards. And this is one example, I think, where we need to force the overseas territories to be more transparent. And as you've pointed out, there can be hybrid companies which may be hiding behind, American or UK company directors, but in essence be actually Tajik controlled. There are so many different schemes you can do to hide the ownership now that it is so difficult to unravel them. And even law enforcement, when they can find a crime, has extreme difficulty finding out who the owner is, because they'll go to Tajikistan, they won't get any answer. And even if they do, they might then have to go to the British Virgin Islands or to Turks and Caicos Islands. They then have to, and you have these companies which are laddered with 4 or 5 different levels of company ownership. So it really becomes a very difficult task even for law enforcement, and that is why we need to have more more countries adopt these beneficial ownership registers across the world.
Я еще добавлю к вашему вопросу, Фархо. Дело в том, что, видите ли, вот что касается способов вывода этих денег, допустим, из Таджикистана или из любой другой страны Центральной Азии, способов вывести эти деньги абсолютно 1000. И во всех вот исследованиях, расследованиях, которые мы, допустим, вели с Томом вместе через наше НПО, схемы и механизмы вывода, они могут быть любые. И интересный аспект этой деятельности клептократов, которые занимаются зарабатыванием денег огромных в странах, как Таджикистан, она как раз и заключается в том, вот то, что Том упоминал, что на самом деле, допустим, законодательно, то есть по закону, да, они, может быть, на самом деле и не нарушают никакой закон, допустим, таджикский или любой другой. Но мы будем точно знать, что эти деньги являются результатом какой-то коррупционной деятельности, конечно. И да, действительно очень большая проблема из таких стран, как Таджикистан, и Туркменистан, и Узбекистан, к сожалению, и Кыргызстан, и Казахстан. Кыргызстан сейчас пока нет, но уже мы туда куда-то уже шагаем. Очень сложно получать информацию. Очень сложно получать информацию о компаниях, о владельцах, финансовую информацию, налоговую информацию, любую информацию, потому что страны и режимы эти, они не заинтересованы в том, чтобы был пролит свет на то, что они творят. И, конечно, они будут стремиться в любом случае эту информацию закрывать. Вот. Is there any... Да, Эмин, пожалуйста.
I'm so sorry, but it's a very interesting topic for me. That's why I decided to ask your experts second round of the questions. One question is related with UK jurisdiction, because UK adopted quite progressive law with unexplained wealth order. And now we have few cases from Azerbaijan when UK court decided for his unexplained wealth must confiscate it and transfer it to UK Treasury Department. So do you have cases from Central Asia, and what is follow-up situation? Because in Azerbaijan, when we're asking UK government to give this part of this money back to us for continued our anti-corruption activities, because they do this, they freeze these assets under our investigations, which is we provided via investigative independent medias. But unfortunately, we, as civil society, we're not able to receive these funds back. And most of this amount going to the National Crime Agency staff, because they say we also underpaid. We need more people to expose more corruptions with unexplained wealth order law. This question is related with UK. And as Norwegian Helsinki Committee organized this event, I would like to use the opportunity to ask issues with the Scandic states, because remember the story with the Danske Bank. Danske Bank pays huge fine to Treasury Department. Treasury Department paid 10% to whistleblower, who is helped to expose this corruption. But again, civil society institutions didn't receive anything from this. My question is related with Equinor, Norwegian state oil company, because recently we always criticize them for the last 20 years, because officially for us they're partner in crime with the state oil company of Azerbaijan Republic. we're asking them for why you not invest to the civil society of Azerbaijan for climate change program, for human rights program, etc. Even Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs supported civil society of Azerbaijan. And even we sometimes ask Norwegian diplomats for why you not push Equinor to do something more. They say for they are state in the state in Norway. Nobody, even like MFA, not able to ask them too much. They recently sold biggest part of their Azerbaijani business. We didn't know for how much they sold it. Probably it's also big corruption there. According to Bloomberg, the deal it's approximately 1 billion euros. But how is this possible? Like when one Norwegian state oil company, even theirs named like Equinor, they sold it business nobody in Norway know for how much they sold it back to Azerbaijani state oil company, and now state company of Azerbaijan planning to selling this part of the recently gotten from the Equinor for higher price. And the difference between prices is like a reasonable corruption questions for us. Why nobody in Norway asking them for guys for how much state energy company sold their part for in Azerbaijan? Because in Azerbaijan we ask our state oil company, and even I try to ask like Equinor representatives, they never respond anything to us. Thank you, and again thanks for this event.
So very quickly on the unexplained wealth order. Yeah, I think it demonstrates my point. The only successful unexplained wealth order was, as you pointed out, against Hajiev and his wife, the famous wife who spent £16 million in Harrods. He had fallen out of favor, so it was much easier to freeze those properties, whereas the second unexplained wealth order, which featured property owned by the family of the Kazakh president, that one failed. And that, again, shows my point about it's very hard to bring these cases against people in power. Maybe times are changing. You obviously know about the Feyziev case. Finally, property has been frozen there. Somebody who still looks like holds power in Azerbaijan, still a member of the parliament. I think perhaps in the future, unexplained wealth orders won't be used as much, but account freezing orders, which are similar but actually freeze bank accounts, seem to be bearing much more fruit in the UK. So I think we'll see more of those. Asset return is a whole other subject. Maybe we can get into after this panel. Very briefly, I worked on two asset return cases in Kazakhstan. The first one, they brought in an international agency, managed it properly, and that money went to impoverished families in Kazakhstan. The second one basically went back to Nazarbayev's political party because they didn't have those checks and balances. So my feeling is that probably UK thought, this is too complicated. You know, we don't want to send it back just to the bad guys. Who knows which is an independent NGO and which is a gongo. So we'll just keep it for ourselves. Thank you very much, because it's just so much easier to do that. But I agree with you. It should go to good causes. It should go to NGOs working on human rights and anti-corruption efforts. I just think this is a little bit beyond the UK at the moment.
Regarding Equinor and Azerbaijan, we do agree that state companies and other companies should support civil society. But when it comes to Azerbaijan, I haven't worked on Azerbaijan since 2011, and I'm very sorry I don't have the information you're requesting. But you should talk to my colleagues, and I guess you're in touch with them in Oslo as well.
Well, thank you very much for attending our side event. If you have still more questions, you're welcome to catch the speakers. Otherwise, we hope to see you again. Thank you.